Hi and welcome back. So part 1 talked about the challenges involved in even measuring loudness and introduced the best method we have currently. But now we know how we're measuring it, let's talk about how loud you should go. And let's start with CDs. These were ground zero for the loudness war back in the 90s and the noughties, seeing average levels pumped up way beyond the point at which the music started to suffer. However, CDs are no longer the main consumer format. While they're far from dead, most people are more likely to listen to streaming services these days, and CDs are more specialist. I would argue that if people listen to CDs, they're probably putting on a whole album and listening all the way through, much as someone might listen to vinyl. So I'm going to venture the perhaps controversial opinion that overall loudness no longer matters for CDs. Your listener will press play on the first song and set their own volume control accordingly. Hold that thought, because we'll come back to it. And then all that matters is that the relative level of each song is good. So my optimum CD mastering workflow would be to level match all the songs relative to each other first, add any further processing required to make them sound the way they should, and then use a single limiter to raise the level of the whole album by the same amount. Use the loudest or highest peaking mix to judge this, and start pushing the levels until the peaks just start to touch the threshold, and you get the first bits of red appearing on the gain reduction graph at the top. Now check the short-term loudness and see how loud you are. With the peaks now up at 0, the loudness reading tells us roughly what our peak to average ratio is. A very natural and dynamic mix might have average levels 17 or even 18 dB lower than the peak levels. But I find that with a typical pop or rock mix, once I've used enough compression and saturation to make it sound as it should, it will naturally already have a peak to average ratio more like 14 or 15 dB. Pushing the levels further than this will now start to reduce the peak to average ratio. However, in most cases, the first few dB are essentially free. Knocking a decibel or two off occasional loud peaks is likely to be completely inaudible, especially with a good limiter like Pro L2. But every extra decibel of level you add from this point will not only result in an extra decibel of limiting for the peaks, but also bring more peaks up to the threshold, so the limiter kicks in more often. And the effects of the limiting will start to increase exponentially as you push the levels harder. The more red you get at the top of the plugin, the more important it becomes to listen carefully to what you're doing and compare it to the unlimited version. But we can't do that by simply bypassing the plugin, as the big volume difference makes it impossible to properly assess the effects of the limiting. So at this point it might be a good idea to turn on 1-to-1 mode in Pro L2 and turn up your monitors instead. Now we can bypass the limiting without the gain boost and hear exactly what the limiting is doing. Now you can push the levels until you start to hear negative effects from the limiter, and then back it off again or tweak the limiter settings until they go away. And you've now found the optimum loudness for this mix. If you turn off 1-to-1 mode, this is now as loud as it will go with no negative consequences whatsoever. And honestly, for a CD release, which can now be considered a specialist audiophile format, there is really no reason to push the levels any further than this. But we also need to consider the peak levels. These are currently right up at 0 dB. But it's traditional to leave a little headroom to accommodate the intersample peaks I mentioned earlier. Well, in fact, Pro L2 provides a true peak limiting option on by default. And the meters also have a true peak mode, again on by default. This means that the limiter will not allow any ISPs at all, and you can trust the peak meter to confirm that for you. In technical terms, true peak limiting and metering means oversampling the signal to generate values in between samples. For even better results, try turning on oversampling for the audio path as well, which will also reduce aliasing from the limiter. As we now have no ISPs at all, it would theoretically be safe to push the peak levels right up to 0 dBFS. We know that the resulting analog signal will not peak any higher. But there is a good reason not to do that. Lossy data compression, such as MP3 or AAC, changes the shape of the waveform subtly, and those ISPs come back again as a result. Of course, there is no data compression on an audio CD, but it's quite likely that someone might want to rip their CD copy to a more portable format. And for practical reasons, it's also desirable to have a single master which can work for all formats and platforms, including those that use lossy data compression. Unfortunately, the mastering engineer has no control over the encoding process. While people like me might be willing to pay extra for lossless streaming, most people will be content with lossy AAC streams, and many will be listening to free ad-supported services, which typically stream at very low bit rates. The lower the bitrate, the more likely you are to get ISPs, and the larger they tend to be. It's also quite difficult to assess how big a problem any ISPs actually present. If you're producing using a respectable quality audio interface, your converters will probably handle ISPs gracefully, and they'll sound fine. But that doesn't mean they'll still sound fine on all consumer devices. The only way a mastering engineer can affect the prevalence of ISPs after encoding and decoding is to avoid smashing the mix too aggressively. So I would recommend using the limiter tastefully and carefully, leaving 1 decibel of headroom for ISPs as recommended by the major streaming platforms, then not worrying about it any further. But now we've moved on to streaming platforms, we need to discuss another relatively new development that is loudness normalizing. Of course, it's quite annoying if you have to keep adjusting your volume control while listening to a playlist. Hold that thought, we'll come back to it. So in the absence of any industry-wide standards, the streaming platforms have created their own. Basically, they will analyze the audio and calculate a loudness value, then they adjust the playback levels to match their target loudness. If you're watching this video in a browser, you can right-click and choose Stats for Nerds and see exactly what YouTube has done to the audio. Of course, I'm still making it, so this is a recent video about Saturn II instead. The part we're interested in is here. My video was 0.2 dB quieter than YouTube's reference level. That's not very much. Basically, my video is exactly the loudness that YouTube aims for, and the playback level isn't being changed at all. Now let's compare this with a Billie Eilish video. I won't play the audio for obvious reasons, but it's here on YouTube if you want to find it. This time the stats say the audio is 4.6 dB louder than YouTube's reference, and YouTube responds by turning it down, or reducing the amplitude to 59% of the original, as the numbers to the left tell us. On YouTube, this video plays at the same apparent loudness as my Saturn II video, but the peaks are much lower. I'm going to suggest you find this video and skip to the 3-minute mark, and listen to that big crescendo when the boat explodes, and notice how crunchy and distorted it sounds at the climax. I don't know if that was intentionally done in the mix, or if it's the sound of a limiter working too hard. But the fact is, that loud section could have been quite a lot louder without really affecting the playback level of the rest of the song at all. Would it have been more exciting and dramatic like that? I can't say for sure, but I'd bet on yes. Incidentally, don't take this as a criticism of Billie Eilish or Phineas. I'm a big fan. I could have picked many other examples, and many a lot worse. Anyway, most streaming platforms currently work the same way as YouTube. The loudness is analysed and compared to a reference level. If the level is lower than the reference, nothing happens, and the audio plays at its original level. But if it's louder than the reference, it gets turned down accordingly. Spotify has been the biggest exception, using the older replay gain system instead of loudness units, until quite recently. But more importantly, Spotify will turn up quiet songs and might limit the peaks if necessary. This has been the most compelling argument for aiming at a target loudness. If it's going to get limited anyway, better you do it with a good limiter than allow Spotify to butcher it in the player. But also, in a sense, Spotify provides the most compelling argument not to aim for a target, because, breaking news, they're now disabling the limiter for most users. I've actually had to re-edit this video to include this information. So Spotify has been gradually moving closer to the other platforms, and now uses R128 loudness units with a reference level of -14 LUFS. That's the same target level as YouTube. And in fact, minus 14 LUFS is emerging as a de facto audio standard in the absence of an official industry-wide standard. If the optimum loudness setting that we discussed earlier is already higher than minus 14, then you're golden. Pushing the levels any higher is pointless, as the streaming platforms will just turn it back down again. If your optimum loudness is quieter than minus 14 LUFS, however, then you need to make a decision. Should you push the levels up to minus 14 so the master doesn't play quieter on some platforms, or is it better to prioritise sound quality and leave your mix to breathe as much as it wants to? In all honesty, that's not a question I can answer for you. By all means, try pushing the levels up to the target and assess how much damage you're doing. But here's something to bear in mind while you decide. Minus 14 LUFS is not in fact an industry standard. There is no industry standard. Some streaming platforms use different target levels, and the levels, or even methods of measuring loudness, are subject to change at any time. Spotify have illustrated this point nicely by rolling out a change as I edit this video. As any information I give about each platform might have changed by the time you watch this video, I'm instead going to recommend a website, loudnesspenalty.com. This allows you to analyse an audio file and will tell you exactly what the normalization will do on the major platforms. Hopefully this website will be updated as the platforms change their standards and will help you to make a more informed decision about your target levels. But this brings me back to the secret I teased at the top of the video. There is a way to defeat the loudness normalization and make your mix play louder than everyone else's. And that can be real loudness, not artificial loudness. And it's not even a secret, in all honesty, rather a truth so obvious and glaring that it gets overlooked. Every music playback system everywhere, whether it's an iPhone with earbuds or a DJ mixer plugged into a PA system, has a volume control with a human being in charge of it. If you press play and you can't hear it properly, you'll turn it up, without even giving it a second thought. And if it starts playing obnoxiously loud, you're not just going to sit there and suffer, you'll turn it down. There's the thought I asked you to hold on to earlier. The loudness war is not just self-defeating now that we have loudness normalization on our streaming platforms. It was always self-defeating, even when CDs were king. Because if the loudness is not normalized automatically, it will just be normalized manually instead. So the secret of maximum loudness is hack your listener's brain and make them want to turn it up. How do you do that? Simple, really. Just make it sound as good as possible. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.